On a crisp October morning in 2008, Charlotte police officer Derek Martinez pulled up to a seemingly ordinary storage facility on the outskirts of the city. What started as a routine investigation into missed rental payments would soon unveil one of North Carolina's most chilling series of murders. "The smell hit me before I even opened the unit," Martinez would later testify. "In 15 years on the force, I'd never encountered anything like it." Unit 23B belonged to Angela Mason, a 34-year-old respiratory therapist who worked at Charlotte General Hospital. She had missed 3 months of payments, triggering the facility's investigation protocol. But what lay behind that rolling metal door would shake the entire community to its core. Inside, investigators found carefully organized evidence of 6 murders, each victim methodically dismembered and preserved. The killer had maintained a detailed journal, describing not only the murders but her motivations. It was a story of revenge that began 12 years earlier, in 1996, when Angela Mason was still Angela Thompson, a promising young nursing student with dreams of helping others. Angela Thompson grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Charlotte, the only daughter of a high school teacher and a librarian. Former classmates described her as quiet but kind, always willing to help others with their studies. She graduated from West Charlotte High School in 1992 with honors and earned a full scholarship to study nursing at UNC Charlotte. "Angela was the last person you'd expect to become a killer," said Dr. Sarah Williams, her former psychology professor. "She was compassionate, dedicated, and had a genuine desire to heal people. Something fundamental had to break inside her to create such a dramatic transformation." That breaking point came during her final year of nursing school. Angela had been dating Michael Preston, a charismatic business major, for 2 years. They were planning to get married after graduation. But Michael harbored a dark secret. He was part of a group of men who preyed on young women, drugging and assaulting them at college parties. On April 15, 1996, Angela became one of their victims. She was drugged at a spring break party and assaulted by 6 men, including her fiancé. The attack was filmed, but the video was later destroyed. Despite physical evidence and Angela's testimony, all 6 men were acquitted due to their wealthy family's influence and connections in the local legal system. The trauma and injustice transformed Angela. She dropped out of nursing school just months before graduation and disappeared from Charlotte for several years. Police would later discover she had moved to Miami, where she studied respiratory therapy and began meticulously planning her revenge. "She didn't just snap," explained FBI profiler Dr. James Cooper. "This was a calculated long-term plan for retribution. She spent years developing the skills and patience needed to execute her revenge without detection." Angela returned to Charlotte in 2002 under her married name Mason after a brief marriage and divorce in Florida. She secured a position at Charlotte General Hospital, where her work was exemplary. Colleagues remembered her as professional and efficient, though somewhat reserved. She was always willing to pick up extra shifts, especially night shifts, recalled nurse Paula Jenkins. Now we know why she preferred working when the hospital was quieter. In March 2003, Michael Preston disappeared. As the ringleader of Angela's assault, he was her first target. By then, he had become a successful investment banker in Charlotte, married with a young daughter. The police initially suspected his disappearance was related to financial troubles, as he had recently lost several major clients. What investigators would later piece together from Angela's meticulously kept journals was far more disturbing. She had spent months studying Preston's routine, learning that he frequently worked late at his downtown office. Using her medical knowledge, she approached him in the parking garage, posing as a distressed woman having an asthma attack. Michael's weakness was always his ego, she wrote in her journal. He couldn't resist playing the hero, especially for a damsel in distress. Once he approached to help, Angela used a modified medical-grade tranquilizer, one that wouldn't be detected in routine toxicology screens. She had carefully prepared a soundproofed room in her basement, complete with medical restraints and surgical equipment. Angela's position as a respiratory therapist provided the perfect cover. She worked with critically ill patients, often during night shifts, and had access to various medications and medical equipment. Her understanding of human anatomy and hospital protocols helped her avoid detection. She knew exactly how to make people disappear without raising immediate alarms, Detective Sarah Rodriguez explained. These men were all single or had strained family relationships. Their disappearances weren't initially connected. Between 2003 and 2008, Angela systematically tracked down and eliminated each of her attackers. After Preston came James Cooper, no relation to the FBI profiler, a real estate developer who had moved to Raleigh. Then Thomas Werner, a corporate lawyer. David Phillips, who had become a high school football coach. Robert Sanchez, a car dealership owner. And finally, William Harris, who was working as a financial consultant. Each murder followed a similar pattern. Angela would study her target for weeks, learning their routines and vulnerabilities. She used different approaches, sometimes playing a damsel in distress, other times posing as a potential client or business contact. But the end result was always the same. Her victims would wake up restrained in her basement. What made her crimes particularly chilling was the medical precision, forensic expert Dr. Maria Chen noted. She didn't torture her victims out of sadistic pleasure. This was clinical, methodical revenge. Angela kept each man alive for exactly 24 hours, the same amount of time she had spent recovering from her assault in 1996. She would explain to them exactly why they were there, showing them copies of the police reports and court documents from her case. Then, using her medical training, she would administer a lethal combination of drugs that would leave no trace in a standard autopsy. After each murder, Angela meticulously dismembered the bodies using surgical tools. She preserved the remains using medical-grade chemicals and stored them in specially designed containers. Each container was labeled with the victim's name and the date of their original crime against her, along with the date of their death. The storage unit where she kept these containers was climate-controlled and paid for in cash. She had chosen a facility on the outskirts of town, one with minimal security cameras and a policy of respecting client privacy. For 5 years, no one questioned the well-dressed medical professional who visited her unit every few months. During these years, Angela maintained an outwardly normal life. She was respected at work, paid her taxes on time, and even volunteered at a local animal shelter. She dated occasionally, but never let relationships become serious, always citing her demanding work schedule as the reason. Angela was the kind of colleague you could always count on, said Dr. Thomas Wright, her supervisor at Charlotte General. She would cover shifts during holidays, never complained, and was excellent with patients. Finding out about her crimes was like discovering a stranger had been wearing her face. Her neighbors described her as quiet but friendly, always willing to collect mail or water plants when they were away. She maintained a small garden, drove a modest car, and seemed, by all accounts, utterly unremarkable. The carefully constructed facade began to crack in late 2008. Angela's final victim, William Harris, had been more connected than she realized. As a financial consultant, he had regular meetings that couldn't be easily explained away by a sudden disappearance. His sister, Catherine Harris Bennett, was a former prosecutor who refused to accept the police's initial dismissal of her brother's disappearance. Something was wrong, Catherine would later testify. We'll never miss our Sunday calls with Mom. Never. When he didn't call for 2 weeks straight, I knew something had happened. Catherine's persistence led to a deeper investigation. Security footage from Harris's office building showed him leaving with a woman who matched Angela's description. It was the first solid lead in any of the disappearances. The breakthrough came when Detective Rodriguez noticed a pattern. Each of the missing men had connections to UNC Charlotte from the mid-1990s. When she dug deeper into that time period, she discovered Angela's assault case. It was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle, Rodriguez recalled. Suddenly, all these seemingly unrelated disappearances had a common thread. Surveillance of Angela led them to the storage facility. When she missed payments for the first time in 5 years, it gave police the opportunity they needed to legally inspect the unit. What they found inside was described by one officer as a medical student's nightmare. 6 specialized storage containers, each holding preserved human remains. A journal detailing every murder with clinical precision. medical instruments, all meticulously cleaned and organized. And perhaps most disturbingly, copies of old photographs showing Angela with Michael Preston before the assault, labeled simply "before." On October 15, 2008, Angela Mason was arrested while leaving her shift at Charlotte General Hospital. She offered no resistance and, according to arresting officers, seemed almost relieved. "She looked at me and said, 'I've been waiting for you,'" Officer Martinez remembered. Then she asked if we'd found her journal, saying it would explain everything. The hospital was thrown into chaos as FBI agents searched her locker and office. They found nothing suspicious at work. She had kept her professional space completely separate from her crimes. As investigators dug into Angela's life, they discovered how methodically she had planned everything. She had purchased her house specifically for its basement access and remote location. She had taken extra courses in anatomy and chemistry during her time in Miami. She had even maintained a separate bank account funded by cash deposits to pay for the storage unit and supplies. This wasn't just revenge, FBI profiler Cooper explained. This was someone reclaiming control through medical precision. She wasn't just killing these men, she was conducting her own form of justice. The journal provided investigators with detailed accounts of each murder. Angela had written extensive entries about her victims, including their reactions when they recognized her and realized why they had been targeted. The case sent shockwaves through Charlotte. Many who knew the victims struggled to reconcile their public personas with their past actions. Several other women came forward with similar stories about the men, though the statute of limitations had long expired on any potential charges. The medical community was particularly shaken. Angela's colleagues struggled to understand how someone who had devoted her life to saving patients could methodically take lives. She was excellent at her job, her former supervisor, Dr. Wright, stated. There were patients alive today because of her skills. It's hard to reconcile that with what she did. The trial of Angela Mason began on March 1, 2009, at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Marcus Bennett, faced a unique challenge: how to present a sympathetic victim of sexual assault as a calculated serial killer. The courtroom was packed every day, with lines forming before dawn. National media descended on Charlotte, dubbing Angela the Angel of Death due to her medical background and methodical approach to murder. The state will prove that Angela Mason carried out these murders with cold, calculated precision, Bennett declared in his opening statement. While her own victimization was tragic, it does not justify the taking of 6 lives. Angela's defense team, led by prominent attorney Sarah Richardson, took an unusual approach. Instead of pleading insanity or denying the crimes, they acknowledged her actions while focusing on the systematic failures that led to them. The justice system failed Angela Thompson in 1996, Richardson argued. When society's protections break down, when wealth and privilege shield the guilty, we shouldn't be surprised when victims seek their own justice. The defense team introduced Angela's original assault case, including previously sealed evidence that had been suppressed during the 1996 trial. They brought forward other victims of the men, painting a picture of systematic abuse protected by money and influence. On the trial's 10th day, Angela testified in her own defense. The courtroom fell silent as she calmly described both her assault and the subsequent murders. She spoke in the same clinical tone she had used in her journal entries. "I didn't want their deaths to be painful," she testified. "That would have made me like them. I wanted them to understand why they were there, to have time to reflect on their actions, and then to experience a peaceful ending, more than they gave me or their other victims." Her testimony lasted 3 days. She never showed remorse for the murders, but expressed regret that their families had to suffer. "Families are always the collateral damage," she said. "I understood that from my own experience." The prosecution's medical experts were impressed despite themselves by Angela's technical precision. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the state's chief medical examiner, testified about the sophistication of the methods used. "These weren't crimes of passion," Dr. Rodriguez explained to the jury. "Each step was carefully planned to minimize suffering while ensuring death. The preservation techniques used on the remains showed extensive knowledge of medical procedures. The defense used this testimony to reinforce their portrayal of Angela as someone seeking justice rather than revenge, highlighting the contrast between the violence of her assault and the clinical nature of her crimes. The victims' families testified about the impact of losing their loved ones. Some, like Michael Preston's wife, had discovered disturbing truths about their family members through the trial. "I don't know who to grieve for anymore," Susan Preston testified. "The man I thought I married never existed, but his death destroyed our daughter's life." Other family members expressed more complex emotions. William Harris's sister Catherine, whose investigation had helped break the case, spoke about the conflict she felt. "Will was my brother, and I loved him," she testified. "But learning what he did, what they all did, I understand why Angela felt the system failed her, because it did." After 6 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Angela Mason was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. However, they included with their verdict a rare written statement to the court about the exceptional circumstances of the case. The judge, considering both the severity of the crimes and their context, sentenced Angela to life in prison without the possibility of parole, rather than the death penalty sought by the prosecution. "This case shows us the devastating ripples of violence," Judge Margaret Chen said during sentencing. "When justice fails, it damages not just the immediate victims, but the entire fabric of society." Angela Mason began serving her sentence at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh. Unlike many high-profile inmates, she adjusted quietly to prison life, using her medical knowledge to work in the prison infirmary. "She's a model inmate," prison warden Janet Collins reported in 2015. "She helps teach other inmates basic health care and first aid. It's as if she's returned to her original purpose of helping others." Fellow inmates nicknamed her Doc, seeking her advice for various medical issues. Prison staff noted that she never spoke about her crimes unless directly asked, and even then, discussed them with the same clinical detachment she had shown during the trial. The case fundamentally changed Charlotte's legal landscape. Catherine Harris Bennett, despite her personal connection to the case, used her position to advocate for stronger sexual assault prosecution and reforms in how wealth influenced legal outcomes. "My brother's death was tragic," she said in a 2010 interview. "But it exposed a system that had been protecting predators for decades. That had to change." Charlotte General Hospital implemented stricter background checks and monitoring systems for access to medical supplies. The storage facility industry in North Carolina faced new regulations about monitoring and reporting suspicious activities. Several cold cases were reopened as more women came forward with stories about the 6 men. Though no additional charges could be filed due to statutes of limitations, these revelations helped other victims find closure. "Angela's case gave us a voice," said Jennifer Martinez, who had been assaulted by Thomas Werner in 1995. "Even though what she did was wrong, she exposed a truth many of us had been forced to keep silent about." The case became required study material in criminal justice programs across the country, examining both the failures that led to the crimes and the complicated moral questions they raised. In 2012, a legal battle erupted over Angela's journal. Several publishers showed interest in releasing it as a book, seeing its potential as both a true crime narrative and a psychological study. Angela opposed publication, wanting to donate the journal to a women's rights organization for research instead. "These aren't just my stories to tell," she wrote in a statement. "They belong to every woman who was ever silenced by money or power." The journal eventually went to a research foundation studying the intersection of trauma and justice, with all proceeds supporting sexual assault survivor programs. The American Medical Association used the case to revise its guidelines on monitoring healthcare workers' access to controlled substances. Angela's ability to obtain drugs and medical supplies without detection led to nationwide changes in hospital security protocols. "The Mason case showed us our blind spots," said Dr. Robert Chen, who headed the AMA Task Force on Medical Security. "We had to balance trust in our medical professionals with better safeguards." By 2019, Angela had served 10 years of her life sentence. She had earned multiple certificates in prison healthcare management and helped establish a peer counseling program for inmates with trauma histories. She received regular letters from sexual assault survivors, which she never answered directly, instead donating them to researchers studying trauma response. Her only public statement in recent years came through her attorney. "I know what I did was wrong, but I don't live in regret. I live in hope that my case helped change a system that needed changing." Sometimes it takes a monster to expose the real monsters hiding in plain sight. The case left a complex legacy in North Carolina. Annual conferences on legal reform cited it as a turning point in how the justice system handled sexual assault cases. Law enforcement developed new protocols for connecting seemingly unrelated disappearances. The storage unit where the remains were found was eventually demolished, replaced by a women's health clinic. Local residents said this felt like appropriate symbolic justice. Catherine Harris Bennett went on to establish a foundation helping sexual assault survivors navigate the legal system. "We can't change what happened," she said at the foundation's opening, "but we can work to ensure it never happens again." By 2024, the Mason case had become more than just a true crime story. It sparked nationwide discussions about privilege in the justice system, trauma response, and the fine line between justice and revenge. Several documentaries explored the case, each taking different approaches to the complex moral questions it raised. The most notable, The Angel's Shadow, 2020, interviewed both survivors of the original 6 men and families of the victims, showing how cycles of violence affect entire communities. Dr. Patricia Morgan, a leading criminologist, noted, "The Mason case defies simple categorization. She wasn't a typical serial killer motivated by psychological compulsion or sadistic pleasure. Her actions were calculated responses to specific injustices. This makes her case particularly challenging for criminal psychology." Charlotte General Hospital underwent significant changes in the years following Angela's arrest. The case prompted a complete overhaul of their hiring practices and security protocols. "We had to acknowledge that someone could be both an excellent healthcare worker and harbor dark secrets," explained Dr. James Wilson, who became chief of staff in 2015. Angela's competence had made her invisible in many ways. That couldn't happen again. The hospital established one of the country's first comprehensive support programs for healthcare workers who experienced trauma, recognizing that unresolved trauma could manifest in unexpected ways. The case influenced legal reforms across multiple states. The Mason Act, passed in North Carolina in 2012, strengthened protocols for sexual assault cases and established stricter oversight of evidence handling. "We saw how wealth and connections had corrupted the system," said State Senator Maria Rodriguez, who sponsored the bill. "The Mason case showed us the terrible consequences of justice delayed and denied." The reforms included mandatory training for law enforcement in handling sexual assault cases, stricter penalties for evidence tampering, and new guidelines for investigating connections between seemingly unrelated crimes. As Angela entered her 15th year of incarceration, her story continued to evolve. She earned a master's degree in public health through a prison education program and developed a comprehensive health education curriculum for inmates. "She's helped hundreds of women understand their bodies and health needs," said prison education coordinator Sarah Thompson. "It's like she's finally fulfilled her original calling to be a healer, just in a very different context than she planned." Fellow inmates reported that Angela never spoke about her victims, but would sometimes talk about her life before 1996. "She tells stories about wanting to be a nurse, about helping people," said former inmate Lisa Martinez. "You can see the person she might have been." The families of Angela's victims dealt with their losses in different ways. Michael Preston's daughter, now an adult, became an advocate for sexual assault prevention. "I lost my father twice," she said in a 2023 interview. "First to the truth about who he was, then to what that truth caused." Robert Sanchez's mother established a scholarship fund for sexual assault survivors. "I couldn't change what my son did," she explained, "but I could try to help heal some of the harm he caused." Angela's case generated numerous academic studies in fields ranging from criminology to psychology to gender studies. Researchers were particularly interested in her methodical approach and medical precision. She represents a unique category of revenge killer, wrote Dr. Elizabeth Chen in her 2021 study. Her medical training wasn't just a means to kill. It reflected her desire to separate herself from the brutality she had experienced. The case entered popular culture in various ways. A fictionalized version appeared in several TV shows, though none captured the full complexity of the real events. True crime podcasts regularly featured it, often sparking heated debates among listeners about justice versus revenge.